October 12, 1942. Murmansk, Soviet Union. The frozen wind cuts like a blade across the harbor as Colonel Dmitry Volkov stamps his boots against the wooden dock, watching the American Liberty ship SS John Witherspoon settle into port. Ice crystals form on his mustache. Behind him, a cluster of Red Army transport officers huddle in their greatcoats, breath steaming in the Arctic air. They've been summoned to inspect the latest shipment under the Lend-Lease program. Another promise from the Americans, another delivery that Volkov expects will prove as disappointing as the rest. The first crates come off slowly, swaying on cargo nets. Then the dock workers unsecure something different. Not tanks, not artillery pieces, not even the trucks they desperately need. Instead, down the gangway roll dozens of small, boxy vehicles, so compact they look like children's toys compared to the massive ZIS-5 trucks that strain and break down on every muddy road from Moscow to Stalingrad. "Yebat," mutters Captain Sergei Antonov at Volkov's elbow. "They send us this?" The vehicle, painted olive drab, with a flat hood, exposed engine, and a canvas top folded down, sits no higher than a man's chest. Its wheels look absurdly narrow. The entire machine appears to weigh less than a loaded supply cart. An American liaison officer, Lieutenant James Holland, approaches with an interpreter, his breath visible in the cold. "Colonel Volkov?" He extends his hand. "These are Willys MB quarter-ton trucks. We call them Jeeps. You're gonna love 'em." Volkov doesn't shake the hand immediately. He walks slowly around the nearest vehicle, his experienced eye cataloging its deficiencies. The body is stamped steel, thin enough that he suspects a rifle round would punch through it. The engine compartment is tiny. The wheelbase is short, dangerously short for the kind of terrain Soviet forces traverse. There's no armor, no gun mount that he can see, though there's a pedestal behind the passenger seat. The steering wheel sits exposed to the elements. "This is a reconnaissance vehicle?" Volkov asks through the interpreter, his tone flat. "Reconnaissance, supply transport, communications, medical evacuation, forward observation, pretty much whatever you need," Holland replies with the kind of cheerful American optimism that Volkov has learned to distrust. "She's got a 60-horsepower Go Devil engine, 4-wheel drive, and she'll go places that'll stop anything else you've got." 60 horsepower, Captain Antonov laughs bitterly. "Our Gaz AA has 50, for a vehicle twice this size." Volkov circles back to the front. He's commanded armored columns, directed tank brigades, overseen the repair and maintenance of hundreds of vehicles across 3 fronts. He knows what wins wars in Russia: weight, power, endurance. This American toy has none of those qualities. He can already imagine it, axle deep in the glutinous mud of the Rasputitsa, the autumn and spring thaw that turns every road into a swamp. He can see its narrow wheels spinning uselessly, its lightweight frame high-centered on ruts that a proper truck would simply crush through. But the Americans have sent 500 of these machines on this shipment alone. Someone in Moscow has accepted them. Someone has signed papers, which means Volkov's job is no longer to refuse them. It's to figure out what, if anything, they're good for. "Start it," he orders. Holland climbs into the driver's seat without ceremony, turns the key, and the engine catches immediately, a smooth, mechanical purr that's nothing like the grinding, reluctant roar of a ZIS-5 on a cold morning. Volkov raises an eyebrow. That's the first surprise. Soviet vehicles require coaxing, prayer, and sometimes a hammer in weather like this. "No crank?" Antonov asks. "Electric starter, standard. And she'll run on just about any fuel you can pour into her. Gasoline, kerosene, whatever you've got." Holland releases the clutch, and the Jeep rolls forward across the dock with barely a sound, nimble, responsive, like a cavalry horse compared to the plodding oxen of Soviet transport. He accelerates up the slight incline toward the warehouse district, shifts through the gears with mechanical precision, then executes a turning radius so tight that Volkov actually steps back in surprise. The vehicle pivots almost on its own axis. Four-wheel drive means all four wheels pull. You can lock the front axle in when you need traction. Differential lock too. And the ground clearance, he points under the chassis, 9 inches. It'll straddle obstacles that would gut a regular vehicle. Volkov's skepticism hasn't evaporated, but it's cracking. He's seen enough machinery fail to reserve judgment. Performance in a frozen harbor is one thing. Performance in combat, in the sucking mud 50 kilometers from the front, under artillery fire with a transmission full of grit, that's where Soviet engineering proves its worth or dies. "We test it," Volkov announces. "Tomorrow. Not on roads, real terrain." Holland grins. "Colonel, that's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." October 13th, 1942. 40 kilometers south of Murmansk. The test ground is not a proving range or a parade field. Volkov has deliberately chosen the worst terrain he can find within a morning's drive, a stretch of taiga where the autumn rains have turned the earth into a morass of mud, exposed roots, and half-frozen streams. The kind of landscape that has swallowed entire supply columns, where trucks sink to their axles and stay there until spring. If the American Jeep is going to fail, Volkov wants it to fail now, here, before the Red Army wastes precious fuel and manpower distributing these machines to units that need real vehicles. 3 Soviet trucks are already present when the convoy arrives. A Gaz AA, the backbone of Soviet light transport, a Lend-Lease Studebaker US-6, one of the American heavy trucks that have actually proven useful, and a ZIS-5, the workhorse 3-tonner that hauls everything from ammunition to wounded men. Their drivers stand beside them, smoking, watching as Lieutenant Holland and a Soviet test driver named Corporal Yuri Fedorov unload the Willys Jeep from its transport trailer. The morning sun breaks through the cloud cover, illuminating the test course Volkov has marked out. A steep embankment leading down to a stream, the water running fast and perhaps 3 feet deep. Beyond it, a muddy slope studded with rocks and tree stumps. Then a narrow forest trail that twists through dense undergrowth. Finally, an open field where the autumn rains have created a quagmire that Volkov knows from experience will trap anything with insufficient power or the wrong weight distribution. "The Gaz goes first," Volkov orders. The Gaz AA driver, a veteran named Maxim, with a mechanic's instinct for what his vehicle can and cannot do, slides behind the wheel and fires up the engine. It coughs twice before catching. He eases the truck down the embankment at an angle, trying to maintain momentum. But the moment the front wheels hit the stream, the vehicle lurches and the engine floods. Water sprays over the hood. Maxim guns the engine, and for a moment it looks like he might power through, but the rear wheels lose purchase on the muddy bank and begin to spin. The truck settles deeper. Maxim reverses, trying to back out, but the Gaz is stuck. Rear axle wedged against submerged rocks, front end tilted forward into the current. 2 soldiers wade in with tow cables. It takes 15 minutes and the Studebaker's winch to extract the Gaz, which emerges dripping and defeated, its engine sputtering. Captain Antonov shakes his head. The stream's too deep. No vehicle will make it. "The Studebaker," Volkov says simply. The American-made heavy truck has 6 wheels and a reputation for reliability that even skeptical Soviet officers have grudgingly acknowledged. Its driver, a Ukrainian named Petro, approaches the stream with more confidence. The Studebaker is bigger, heavier, with higher ground clearance and more powerful engine. Petro doesn't hesitate. He aims straight at the water and commits. The truck plunges in with a massive splash. Water surges up past the bumper, but the Studebaker's momentum carries it forward. The engine roars. The wheels find purchase on the stream bed. For a moment it looks like success, then the front end climbs the opposite bank and the rear wheels drop into a depression. The differential housing scrapes rock with a grinding shriek that makes every mechanic present wince. Petro floors it, the engine screaming, and the Studebaker lurches up and out, clearing the stream, but barely. Petro stops on the far side, climbs out and inspects the damage. There's a gouge in the differential casing, leaking oil. "It made it," Antonov says, "but it's wounded." Volkov nods slowly. The Studebaker is a good truck, but it's also a valuable truck, intended for hauling tons of supplies over established roads. Using it for this kind of terrain is wasteful. He turns to Lieutenant Holland. "Your vehicle." Holland doesn't take the wheel himself. Instead, he gestures to Corporal Yuri Fedorov, the young Soviet driver who's been assigned to learn the Jeep's capabilities. Fedorov is perhaps 22, with the lean, hungry look of someone who survived the siege of Leningrad. He approaches the Jeep with visible uncertainty. "Remember what I showed you. Four-wheel drive engaged, low range. Don't overthink it. Let the vehicle do the work." Fedorov climbs in, adjusts the seat, and starts the engine. The Go Devil's 60 horsepower purr sounds almost comical after the Studebaker's roar. Antonov mutters something under his breath about toy cars. Volkov says nothing, watching. Fedorov eases the Jeep down the embankment. The approach angle is steep enough that the front wheels drop suddenly, but the short wheelbase means the rear wheels are still on solid ground when the front hits the water. The Jeep enters the stream nose first and keeps going. Water surges around the wheels, up past the floorboards, but the engine doesn't falter. The four-wheel drive pulls with mechanical certainty. The narrow tires bite into the stream bed. The Jeep doesn't plow through like the Studebaker. It dances through, light enough that it doesn't sink, powerful enough that every wheel contributes traction. Fedorov reaches the far bank, and the Jeep climbs out in one smooth motion, water streaming from its chassis. No grinding, no scraping, no damage. He stops beside the wounded Studebaker, and the size difference is almost laughable. The Jeep looks like a child next to its massive American cousin, but the Jeep is undamaged. On the near bank, the Soviet officers are silent. "Muddy slope next," Volkov calls across the water, his voice carefully neutral. Fedorov shifts into low range and aims the Jeep at the hill. It's a brutal incline, slick with mud, and studded with obstacles that would high-center most vehicles. The Gaz couldn't even attempt it. The Studebaker might make it, but would tear its undercarriage apart trying. The Jeep attacks the slope like a mountain goat. When the front wheels hit a rock, the suspension compresses and the vehicle simply flows over it. When one wheel loses traction in a mudslick, the other three compensate. Fedorov steers around a stump that would destroy the oil pan of any normal truck, the Jeep's narrow track allowing it to thread through gaps that shouldn't exist. Halfway up, the vehicle slides sideways, and Antonov makes a sound of grim satisfaction, but Fedorov corrects with a slight steering adjustment, and the Jeep recovers, clawing its way upward until it crests the hill and disappears into the forest trail. "Боже мой," someone whispers. "My God." They wait. 5 minutes pass, then 10. Volkov begins to wonder if the Jeep has broken down or become stuck somewhere in the woods. Then they hear it, the engine note rising and falling as Fedorov navigates the unseen trail. And then the Jeep emerges from the tree line, bouncing slightly on its suspension, and rolls into the open quagmire that was meant to be the final test. Volkov expects this to be where the American machine finally fails. The mud here is axle-deep, viscous, the kind that holds like concrete. But Fedorov doesn't stop. He keeps momentum, keeps the wheels moving, and the Jeep's light weight becomes an advantage. It doesn't sink as deep as a heavier vehicle would. The four-wheel drive distributes power evenly. The Jeep wallows, fishtails slightly, but it keeps moving, carving twin ruts through the mud until it reaches solid ground on the far side. Fedorov drives back across the stream, more confidently this time, and brings the Jeep to a stop in front of Colonel Volkov. The engine is still purring. There's mud caked on every surface, but nothing is broken, nothing is leaking. Fedorov climbs out, his expression carefully blank, waiting for his superior's judgment. Volkov walks around the vehicle slowly. He crouches to inspect the undercarriage. He checks the differential, the suspension, the engine mounts. Everything is intact. This small, lightweight, improbable machine has just accomplished what none of his Soviet vehicles could do, and it did it casually, almost effortlessly. He straightens and meets Lieutenant Holland's eyes. "How many of these can you send us?" Volkov asks. Holland's grin is triumphant. 50,000 if you need them.
November 1942, March 1943. Various locations across the Eastern Front. The Jeeps spread across the Soviet Union like a mechanical infection, carried by rail to depot after depot, distributed to armies that greet them with the same skepticism Colonel Volkov had shown in Murmansk. But skepticism dies quickly in war, especially when survival depends on accepting what works. At the Stalingrad front, Lieutenant General Vasily Zhukov receives his first allocation of Willys Jeeps in late November, just as the Soviet counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, begins to encircle the German Sixth Army. Zhukov is a practical man, a street fighter who spent months battling house to house in the ruins of the city. He has no patience for equipment that doesn't contribute to killing Germans. When his logistics officer tells him that 15 Jeeps have arrived to supplement his command vehicles, Zhukov's response is a grunt of indifference. 3 days later, his opinion changes. The problem with commanding a fluid, fast-moving encirclement operation is communication. Radio nets are unreliable. Telephone lines get cut by artillery. Runners on foot are too slow. Motorcycles break down on the frozen steppe or get stuck in snowdrifts. Zhukov needs to move between his forward units constantly, making decisions in real time, and every hour spent traveling is an hour not spent directing the battle. His driver, a sergeant named Grigory Pavlov, takes him to visit a tank brigade headquarters 32 kilometers north of their command post. The route crosses open steppe, cut by ravines and frozen streams, then follows a forest trail that's been churned into icy ruts by tank treads. Pavlov drives the Jeep as if it's an extension of his own body, sliding through turns, bouncing over obstacles, maintaining a speed that would be suicidal in a conventional vehicle. They make the trip in 47 minutes. Zhukov's previous vehicle, a captured German Kubelwagen, would have taken 2 hours and probably required a tow at some point. His ZIS-5 command truck would have needed 3 hours and a prayer. The Jeep simply goes, indifferent to conditions that stop other vehicles. "Where did you learn to drive like this?" Zhukov asks as they slide to a stop outside the tank brigade's bunker. Pavlov, who learned to drive on a collective farm and has been behind the wheel of military vehicles since 1939, shrugs. "The machine teaches you, Comrade General. It wants to move. You just pointed where to go." By December, Zhukov insists that every regimental commander in his army have access to a Jeep. By January, he's using them for medical evacuation. Their speed and maneuverability mean wounded men reach aid stations in minutes rather than hours. And in the savage cold of the Russian winter, minutes determine who lives and who dies. By February, his reconnaissance units are mounted entirely in jeeps, racing ahead of advancing Soviet columns to probe German positions, identify weak points, and vanish before the enemy can respond. Word spreads. Other commanders take notice. At the Voronezh front, Major General Pavel Rotmistrov is rebuilding the 3rd Tank Army after heavy losses in previous campaigns. His problem is reconnaissance. Tanks are powerful but blind. They need scouts ranging ahead, reporting enemy positions, finding routes through difficult terrain. His reconnaissance battalions are equipped with BA-64 armored cars, which are adequate on roads, but helpless in mud or snow. Light tanks like the T-60 have firepower, but are slow and mechanically unreliable. Then 50 jeeps arrive in his depot. Rotmistrov's reconnaissance commander, Colonel Anatoly Burda, is initially dismissive. He points out, "They have no armor. A machine gun burst will kill the crew." "Armor doesn't help if you're stuck in the mud waiting for the Germans to find you," Rotmistrov replies. "Speed is armor. Mobility is armor. Try them." Burda tries them. His scouts mount the jeeps with machine guns on the pedestal mounts behind the passenger seats, either Soviet-made DSHK heavy machine guns or American .30 caliber Brownings that arrive with some shipments. They race ahead of the main armored columns, covering ground that speeds the BA-64s could never match. When they encounter German positions, they don't stay to fight. They report locations and withdraw before the enemy can react. The effectiveness is immediate and measurable. Rotmistrov's tank columns stop blundering into ambushes. They find routes around German strongpoints instead of attacking them frontally. Fuel consumption drops because scouts identify the shortest viable paths. Most importantly, casualties decline, both because reconnaissance units survive encounters they would have lost in slower vehicles, and because the tank crews aren't driving blind into prepared defenses. By March 1943, every tank army on the Eastern Front is demanding more jeeps. But it's not just combat units that discover the value of the jeep. The vehicle's versatility reveals itself in 100 unexpected ways across the vast theater of operations. At a field hospital near Kursk, Dr. Nina Sokolov commandeers 2 jeeps and converts them into ambulances. The wounded lie on stretchers mounted across the rear seats and the hood. It's crude, uncomfortable, and exposes patients to the elements, but it's fast. Men who would have bled out during a long truck ride survive because the jeeps deliver them to surgery in time. Sokolov calculates that her 2 jeeps save more lives per week than the hospital's 4 conventional ambulances. At a signals regiment near Smolensk, engineers discover that the Jeep's 60-horsepower engine can drive a portable generator powerful enough to run a complete radio station. They mount the generator on a trailer, tow it into position, and suddenly have mobile communication capability that can keep pace with advancing infantry. The setup is so successful that signals units begin requesting Jeeps specifically for this purpose. At a supply depot outside Moscow, logistics officers find that a Jeep can tow a fully loaded trailer weighing 3/4 of a ton, nearly 4 times the vehicle's own weight, and still maintain speed over rough terrain. Suddenly, supply runs that required a large truck and 3 men can be accomplished by a Jeep with a 2-man crew. Fuel efficiency improves dramatically. Turnaround times drop. Partisan units operating behind German lines begin receiving Jeeps dropped by parachute, disassembled into components. The vehicles arrive in pieces: engine block, chassis, wheels, body panels, packed into crates small enough to fit through an aircraft cargo door. Partisan mechanics assemble them in forest clearings using basic tools. Within hours of a drop, the partisans have a vehicle that can outrun German pursuit, carry supplies to hidden camps, and evacuate wounded fighters to Soviet lines. The reports flow back to Moscow. accumulating on desks at the Stavka, the Soviet High Command. Thousands of small success stories, each one modest in isolation, but collectively they represent something unprecedented, an American piece of equipment that is not just adequate or acceptable, but genuinely superior for its role than anything the Soviet Union produces. In his office in the Kremlin, Marshal Zhukov reviews the logistics summaries. Zhukov is perhaps the most successful general officer the Red Army has produced, the architect of the defense of Moscow, the strategist behind Stalingrad and Kursk, a man with little patience for sentimentality or political niceties. He deals in facts, in numbers, in what works. The numbers regarding the Willys Jeep are remarkable. Soviet mobile operations, the deep penetration raids, the rapid encirclements, the exploitation of breakthroughs are all accelerating. Command and control response times are improving. Reconnaissance effectiveness is increasing. Supply delivery reliability is rising. And in report after report, commanders attribute these improvements to the same factor, the availability of jeeps. Zhukov picks up his telephone and calls the liaison office coordinating Lend-Lease deliveries. He says without preamble, "The American quarter-ton trucks, how many can we get and how quickly?" The answer will reshape the final 2 years of war on the Eastern Front.
July 1943. The Kursk Salient. The largest tank battle in history is about to begin, and Captain Ivan Kozlov is driving straight toward it in a vehicle that weighs less than a dairy cow. His jeep bounces over the rutted steppe road, carrying him and his radio man, Private Leonid Batikov, toward the forward observation post of the 13th Army. Behind them, stretched across hundreds of kilometers, lies the greatest concentration of military power the Soviet Union has ever assembled. 20 armies, over 1 million men, 5,000 tanks, and 25,000 artillery pieces, all waiting for the German offensive that everyone knows is coming. Kozlov's job is reconnaissance, but today he's running courier duty because the radio nets are jammed with last-minute preparations and someone needs to deliver updated maps to the forward positions before the Germans attack. It's the kind of mission that would take hours in a conventional vehicle, assuming you didn't get stuck or break down. In the Jeep, Kozlov expects to make it in 40 minutes. He's been driving Jeeps since February. His first reaction, like most Red Army officers, had been derision. The machine looked too small, too fragile for serious military work. That opinion lasted exactly 1 mission. Now, 5 months later, Kozlov trusts the Jeep more than he trusts most people. The vehicle has never let him down. It's pulled him out of German artillery barrages, carried him through spring mud that swallowed trucks, and once, memorably, outrun a German motorcycle patrol by cutting across terrain the motorcycles couldn't follow. "Contact, front!" Batikov suddenly shouts, pointing ahead. Kozlov sees it the instant he does. 2 German armored cars emerging from a tree line 400 meters away, their distinctive angular profiles unmistakable. SDKF 222 reconnaissance vehicles, probably from a German scouting element probing Soviet positions before the main assault. They've spotted the Jeep. Kozlov doesn't hesitate. He cranks the wheel hard left, away from the road, and floors the accelerator. The Jeep leaps forward like a startled horse, its four-wheel drive grabbing the rough ground. Behind him, he hears the distant rattle of the German 20mm autocannon opening fire, but the range is too great, and the Jeep is already moving erratically, bouncing over the uneven steppe. The German armored cars pursue. They're faster on the road, heavier, better armed. The 222 can hit 60 kilometers per hour on good surfaces, and its autocannon will shred the unarmored Jeep if it finds its mark. But Kozlov isn't staying on the road. He aims for a ravine 50 meters ahead, a natural drainage cut that he knows from previous patrols drops steeply before leveling out. The Jeep hits the edge at full speed and plunges down. For a moment they're airborne, Batakov clutching his seat with both hands, and then they hit the bottom with a bone-jarring impact that compresses the suspension fully. The Jeep absorbs it, recovers, and keeps moving. Kozlov accelerates along the ravine floor, using the terrain as cover. Behind them, the German armored cars stop at the ravine edge. They're too heavy, too valuable to risk a descent that might damage their suspensions. Kozlov watches in his mirror as they pause, consider, then turn back toward the road to find an easier crossing point. By the time they find it, Kozlov is gone, vanished into a network of gullies and creek beds that he's memorized over weeks of reconnaissance work. The Jeep's ground clearance and short wheelbase let it go places that conventional military vehicles can't reach. It's not about armor or firepower. It's about being somewhere the enemy isn't and getting there faster than they can follow. 20 minutes later, Kozlov delivers the maps to the forward observation post, his heart still hammering from the encounter. "You're late," the artillery major greets him. "German scouts," Kozlov explains, climbing out. "2 armored cars." The major's expression sharpens. "Where?" Kozlov points to the location on the map. The major immediately calls it in. Confirmation that German reconnaissance elements are pushing forward, which means the main attack is imminent. Because Kozlov reached the observation post and reported the contact, Soviet artillery commanders now know to watch that sector. This is what the Jeep has made possible. Speed that translates into tactical advantage, mobility that creates intelligence, survival that ensures information reaches the people who need it. The German offensive begins the next morning. Operation Citadel, Hitler's last great attempt to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. Nearly 3,000 German tanks and assault guns, supported by the best divisions the Wehrmacht can field, smash into the Soviet defenses from north and south, trying to pinch off the Kursk salient. The Soviets are ready. They've prepared defensive belts 8 layers deep, planted hundreds of thousands of mines, positioned their armor in reserve for counterattacks. But preparation is static, and warfare is fluid. The battle becomes a sprawling, chaotic melee across hundreds of square kilometers, with breakthroughs and encirclements developing by the hour. This is where the Jeeps prove their value beyond any peacetime demonstration. Soviet commanders, generals directing armies, colonels commanding regiments, race between positions in their Jeeps, making real-time decisions as the situation evolves. When a German breakthrough threatens to collapse a sector, the commander arrives in minutes instead of hours, sees the situation firsthand, commits reserves before the crisis becomes catastrophic. When a Soviet counterattack succeeds and exploits need exploitation, orders arrive while the opportunity still exists. The German army has nothing equivalent. Their commanders rely on heavier, slower vehicles, Kubelwagens that are adequate but not exceptional, captured Soviet trucks that break down constantly, or repurposed civilian cars that can't handle military conditions. German officers spend crucial hours in transit, making decisions based on outdated information, arriving too late to influence outcomes. The cumulative effect is measured in tempo. Soviet forces react faster, adapt more quickly, sustain operations longer. The German offensive, which relies on breakthrough and exploitation, repeatedly finds that Soviet commanders had already responded to developments, reinforcing weak points, shifting reserves, launching flanking attacks, because those commanders could physically reach the battlefield in time to act. At the southern shoulder of the salient, near Prokhorovka, the fighting reaches its crescendo. Over 1,500 tanks clash in a single day. Soviet T-34s and KV-1s against German Panthers and Tigers, fighting at ranges so close that armor advantages disappear and the battle becomes a brutal knife fight. The combat generates chaos, burning vehicles, smoke obscuring vision, units intermingled and disorganized. Into this maelstrom, Soviet reconnaissance jeeps dart like water beetles on a pond. They carry orders from Army headquarters to tank brigade commanders whose radios have been destroyed. They evacuate wounded tank crews from disabled vehicles before German infantry can capture them. They locate German strongpoints and race back with targeting information for artillery batteries. They're everywhere, moving too fast for German anti-tank guns to track, too small to prioritize when Tigers and T-34s are trying to kill each other. Captain Kozlov, still running reconnaissance missions, finds himself delivering emergency ammunition to a tank company whose supply trucks have been destroyed. His Jeep carries 40 anti-tank rifle rounds and 3 crates of 7.62 millimeter ammunition. Not much, but enough to keep the company fighting for another hour. He makes 3 trips in conditions where heavier vehicles couldn't make one, each time navigating through burning wreckage and cratered ground, each time emerging intact because the Jeep can go where the battle isn't. On his 4th trip, approaching a forward position with medical supplies, he encounters a German Tiger tank grinding forward through the smoke. The Tiger's commander hasn't seen him yet. The massive tank is focused on hunting Soviet T-34s. Kozlov has no weapon that could scratch the Tiger's armor, but he has speed. He floors the accelerator and cuts behind the Tiger, using a burning T-34 as cover. The Tiger's turret begins to transverse, but Kozlov is already gone, the Jeep weaving between obstacles at a speed the Tiger can't match. 30 seconds later, he's out of the German tank's visual range, delivering medical supplies to aid station personnel who are working in shell craters because their bunker was destroyed. This happens 10,000 times across the Kursk battlefield. Small moments where speed and mobility create survival, where vehicles that can go anywhere enable actions that wouldn't otherwise be possible. The Jeeps don't win the battle by themselves, but they make winning possible by ensuring that Soviet forces can move, communicate, supply, and command faster than their enemy. The Battle of Kursk lasts until August. When it ends, the German offensive has failed catastrophically. The Wehrmacht has lost the initiative on the Eastern Front permanently. Soviet forces begin the relentless westward advance that will end in Berlin.
And in the after-action reports compiled by Soviet staff officers analyzing what worked and what didn't, one piece of equipment appears repeatedly in the essential category: the American Willys Jeep. Marshal Zhukov reads these reports in his field headquarters, surrounded by maps showing German armies in retreat. He's already writing his request to the Lend-Lease administration. Send more Jeeps, send them faster, prioritize them above almost everything else. Because Zhukov has realized something that will later become his most famous quote about American assistance: "We could have continued fighting without American steel, but without American trucks, and especially without the Jeep, we would have lost the war."
January 1945. The Vistula-Oder Offensive. The snow is falling heavy over Poland when Major General Nikolai Orlov receives the order that will define the final months of the war. Break through the German defenses west of Warsaw, advance 600 kilometers in 3 weeks, and establish bridgeheads across the Oder River, the last major natural barrier before Berlin. It's an audacious plan, the kind of deep operation that Soviet military theorists have dreamed about since the 1930s, but could rarely execute. The concept requires speed, coordination, and relentless momentum, exploiting breakthroughs before the enemy can seal them, maintaining supply lines across vast distances, keeping dispersed units in communication as they race forward. Orlov stands in front of his command jeep, studying the map one final time before the offensive begins. Around him, 2.2 million Soviet soldiers prepared to surge westward across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Carpathians.
His own corps, 25,000 men, 420 tanks, 300 artillery pieces, represents just one spearhead among dozens. The Jeep beside him is his fifth since 1943. The first was destroyed by German artillery near Kharkov. The second broke an axle in the Carpathian Mountains, the only mechanical failure he's experienced with the vehicle. The third he gave to a subordinate who needed it more. The fourth he left behind when he was promoted and transferred. This fifth Jeep, nicknamed Lastochka, Little Swallow, by his driver, Sergeant Viktor Medvedev, has carried him through the liberation of Ukraine and into Poland. "Ready, Comrade General?" Medvedev asks, already behind the wheel. Orlov folds the map and climbs into the passenger seat. His radio man, Corporal Alexei Timoshenko, sits in the back with the portable radio set and a DSHK heavy machine gun mounted on the pedestal. The temperature is -15 Celsius, but the Jeep's engine starts immediately. It always does. One turn of the key and the Go Devil engine fires without complaint, a reliability that still amazes Orlov after years of Soviet vehicles that require coaxing in cold weather. The artillery barrage begins at 0500 hours. For 2 hours, Soviet guns pound the German lines with a concentration of firepower that makes the earth shake. Then the tanks roll forward, and behind them, the infantry. Orlov's corps is designated as an exploitation force. Their job isn't to break through the German defenses, but to pour through the gaps once they open and drive as deep as possible before the enemy can react. By noon, the breakthrough is confirmed. A corridor 8 kilometers wide has been opened in the German lines. Orlov doesn't wait for detailed reports. He orders Medvedev forward, directly toward the fighting. The Jeep races along roads churned by tank treads, past columns of infantry trudging westward, through artillery positions still firing. Medvedev drives with practiced confidence, weaving around obstacles, maintaining speed even when the road deteriorates. They reach the breakthrough point in 40 minutes, a landscape of shattered German bunkers and burning vehicles where Soviet tankers are already refueling and rearming. Orlov finds the tank brigade commander, a colonel named Petrov, standing beside his T-34, consulting a map covered in mud and blood. "Report," Orlov demands. "German resistance collapsing, Comrade General," Petrov says, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. "Their mobile reserves are caught out of position. The road to Lodz is open." "How far can you advance today?" Petrov hesitates. In previous offensives, caution would be warranted. Pushing too far too fast risks outrunning supplies and communications, creating vulnerable salients that German counterattacks can cut off. But something has changed in this war. The Red Army has learned to sustain deep operations in ways it couldn't before. 50 kilometers, Petrov says, maybe more if the Germans keep running. "Then go," Orlov orders. "I'll ensure supplies reach you." This is the promise that Jeeps make possible. Orlov's logistics officers are already organizing supply runs using mixed convoys, heavy Studebaker trucks carrying bulk supplies, and Jeeps pulling trailers loaded with ammunition, medical supplies, and fuel. The Jeeps will move faster, reach forward units more quickly, and return for another load while the trucks are still making their first trip. Over the next 3 weeks, the offensive becomes a race. Soviet spearheads advance so rapidly that German units can't establish coherent defense lines. Towns that the Wehrmacht expected to hold for days fall in hours. Counterattacks arrive too late because Soviet commanders, moving in their jeeps, identify threats and reposition forces before German armor can concentrate. Orlov spends those 3 weeks living in his jeep. He sleeps in it during brief halts, eats rations while Medvedev drives, conducts planning sessions in villages while Timoshenko sets up the radio in whatever building is available. The jeep becomes his mobile headquarters, always moving, always present where decisions need to be made. On January 17th, they liberate Chenstohova, On the 19th, they cross the pre-war German-Polish border. On the 23rd, they're fighting in Katowice. By February 2nd, forward elements are crossing the Oder River 600 kilometers from their starting point, establishing the bridgeheads that will become the jumping-off points for the final assault on Berlin. The speed of the advance shocks even Soviet planners. Intelligence estimates had projected 4 to 6 weeks to reach the Oder. They've done it in 3. The difference, acknowledged in staff reports compiled during the operation, is mobility. The ability to move commanders, supplies, intelligence, and reinforcements faster than the enemy can react has compressed timelines and created opportunities that wouldn't have existed in earlier years of the war. Orlov stands on the west bank of the Oder in early February, looking toward Berlin 70 kilometers away. His corps has advanced farther and faster than any unit in military history. They've done it because Soviet tactics have evolved, because German defenses have weakened, because the Red Army has numerical superiority, but also because a small American vehicle allowed them to maintain the tempo of operations that deep penetration requires. Behind him, Lastachka sits idling, Medvedev at the wheel, ready to move the instant Orlov gives the order. April 1945, Berlin. The final battle is chaos incarnate. Street fighting in a city defended by desperate men who know they're fighting for a regime in its death throes. Soviet armies converge from 3 directions, grinding through fortified neighborhoods where every building is a bunker and every intersection is a killing ground. Jeeps aren't designed for urban warfare. Their lack of armor is a fatal liability when fighting room to room. But even here, in conditions utterly different from the steppe warfare they proved their worth, the vehicles find uses. They run communication between assault groups when radios fail. They evacuate wounded soldiers from positions that ambulances can't reach. They bring forward ammunition for units running low in the middle of firefights. They're fast enough to cross open intersections that would trap slower vehicles under German fire. Captain Kozlov, promoted twice since Kursk, now commanding a reconnaissance company, drives his jeep through the ruins of Berlin's suburbs on April 28th, 3 days before the city's final surrender. His mission is to locate a Soviet rifle battalion that's out of contact with headquarters. The streets are cratered by artillery, lined with rubble, complicated by destroyed trams and overturned vehicles. Kozlov navigates by dead reckoning and memory, following routes that exist only in his mind. The jeep climbs over rubble piles, squeezes between buildings, makes sharp turns in intersections swept by occasional sniper fire. He finds the battalion pinned down in a factory district, taking casualties because they can't reach a German strongpoint. Kozlov races back to headquarters, a trip that would take hours on foot through the contested streets, and returns 40 minutes later with 2 anti-tank guns towed behind his jeep and another. The guns deploy, silence the German position, and the advance continues. It's a small moment in a massive battle, one incident among thousands, but it's representative of what the jeep has meant throughout the war. The ability to solve problems through movement, to create options through speed, to sustain operations through reliability.
On May 2, 1945, Berlin surrenders. The war in Europe ends 6 days later. In the aftermath, as Soviet officers compile their memoirs and military analysts study what worked, the Willys Jeep appears repeatedly as a decisive factor. Marshal Zhukov, commander of the armies that took Berlin, orchestrator of the Soviet Union's greatest victories, will later write that the Jeep was among the most important weapons America sent, essential to Soviet mobile warfare. The numbers support his assessment. The United States delivered 51,503 Jeeps to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, more than the USSR produced of any comparable vehicle. Soviet generals used them as command vehicles. Soviet scouts used them for reconnaissance. Soviet logistics units used them to maintain supply lines across vast distances. Soviet medics used them to save lives. Soviet signals troops used them to maintain communications. The skepticism that greeted those first Jeeps in Murmansk in 1942, Colonel Volkov's doubt, Captain Antonov's dismissal, had been burned away by 3 years of war. The Red Army that crossed the Oder and stormed Berlin was more mobile, more responsive, and more effective than the army that had struggled to defend Moscow in 1941. The Jeep didn't win the war alone. Soviet soldiers did that, paying in blood for every kilometer from Stalingrad to Berlin. But the small American vehicle, with its 60-horsepower engine and 9 inches of ground clearance, had given those soldiers something invaluable: the ability to move faster than their enemy, to be where they needed to be, when they needed to be there. In the end, that made all the difference.